By way of introduction, in this video, I'm going to explain why audience research isn't really about audiences. What I mean by that is I'm going to be talking about the fact that the sort of audience research that we're going to talk about this week really inherits a lot of questions from the field of cultural history. And what we're interested in that field is looking at how culture, and by culture, I mean the things that bring the everyday practices that bring people together in a place where they can share ideas and think about their place in the world, how that plays a role in shaping society and history. What I mean by that is the way that culture brings people together in a way that allows them to reflect on how they think the world is and how they want it to be, and actually provides a basis from which people can begin to think about how they would like to actually change their world. So, what we're dealing with here is we are taking audience research and we're placing it within a line of thought that really emerges from the field of history that thinks about how culture, the shared everyday practices that we participate in on a day to day basis, is really important as a place where different points of view on how the world is and how it should work are brought together and really struggle with each other to try and move society in a particular direction. So that is what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to explain how the sort of audience research we're going to talk about this week is connected to a particular view of culture which focuses on the concept of conflict, how it is that different social groups struggle to have their points of view become the dominant or widely accepted points of view in a particular history. Now, in this, what we're really talking about is we're locating audience research into the broader historical question of how culture, the things we do together, promotes two things, both conformity, how does culture help us fit into society as it already exists and the places where groups that are already powerful want us to go, but how does it also foster dissent? How does it produce a situation where people are actually thinking about things in different ways and actually trying to agitate for a certain kind of cultural trend. And ultimately, one of the things we're going to talk about is the way that the apparently silly kind of superficial things that often kind of engross media audiences, and particularly women audiences, how these things are actually really, really important in terms on a political level, in terms of people giving people a political voice. And I'm drawing in this thought on the work of a historian called E.P. Thompson. And E.P. Thompson was very interested in how late 18th and early 19th century culture essentially created popular socialism, how it got people to become politically active, and he was particularly interested in religion and churches, and he was particularly interested in the history of the Methodist Church in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And he said there was something very curious happened during this time in Methodism. So Methodism is a very strict form of of the Protestant religion that became enormously popular during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which was during the Industrial Revolution. And what Thompson discovered was that something really odd. Methodism was a very strict, as I said, form of religion that tried to convince people that if they were having a horrible life, and it was very popular amongst poor people, and what Methodist ministers would argue was that if the poor are having a difficult life, which they all were during the Industrial Revolution, there was a simple reason for that. It was because they were sinners. So it had nothing to do with the exploitation of early capitalism or these terrible factories that were cropping up or the terribly exploitative working relations that were cropping up. It was because they were sinners. So Methodism brought people together and told them that the only solution that they had to their particular problems in life was to pray. It wasn't to, don't try and change society, change yourself, because the problem is in you. You are a sinner. Now, one of the interesting paradoxes that Thompson noted was that if you look at the birth of socialism, which really begins to emerge as a significant political force amongst the working classes in the second decade of the 19th century, one of the interesting things he found was that a lot of the early socialist agitators were Methodists. They were actually people who'd come out of this incredibly strict religion. And the argument that he made was that one of the things that Methodism did was it gave people a place to congregate in the early 19th century. So church was culture. What I mean by that was that church was the place where people came together as a community and began to talk about everyday life. So people, sure, they were talking about, they were going to prayer meetings, and they were going to religious services, and they were being told that they were having a horrible time because they were sinners. But then they were kind of hanging around afterwards, and they were talking to each other, and they were beginning to think, maybe that's not the problem, or maybe we could interpret our religious doctrine in a different way. Maybe the sinners are the people who own the factories. Maybe they're doing things wrong. Maybe we should encourage them to reflect on their sins instead of reflecting on our own. So on the one hand, you have this incredibly strict religion, which is teaching people to just be resigned to their everyday situations. But on the other, in bringing people together, people begin to shape their own ideas, and they're beginning to think, well, hang on, what do we think about this? And that begins to have all kinds of unintended, surprising, but highly effective social and political outcomes. Basically, it's the birth of the Labour movement in Britain. Now, we can begin to say the same thing about media audiences. And in particular, I'm interested in, there's a lot of research on a lot of work done on young women who like boy bands. Okay, so there's a lot of research. Here's a picture of some One Direction fans. One Direction were a very popular boy band a few years ago. And it's kind of interesting that people look at these sorts of audiences in quite patronizing ways. They are silly people who are being manipulated by a higher power, in this case, the music industry. And one might have said the same thing about Methodists if one were being very unkind. But again, what we find is that if we look at research on the reasons why young women are attracted to these sorts of bands and what they are able to do with each other and the sorts of conversations that they are able to have with each other by virtue of the fact that they come together around the object of their fandom, there's actually a very similar process that happens. You begin to have young women finding their voice as young women, talking about sexism in society and talking about how things change. So what we see is that research on media audiences and research on women audiences in particular is a really useful way of applying cultural history, interests in the relationship between culture, uniformity, and dissent, the relationship between culture and conflict, and talking about how that has been transposed into the world of media audiences. We're dealing with the same question. What happens when people are brought together to consider values? And in particular, one of the things that we see is that women audiences quite often are talking about things that really matter in society regarding gender inequality, which is one of the reasons why women audiences make such great subject matter for talking about the relationship between using media and thinking about society. And you don't need to look very far for examples of how everyday examples of how women audiences are brought together by media activities and end up talking about really important political issues. You don't need to look very far for that. This is a picture of Taylor Harris, who's an incredibly talented Australian football. Australian rules footballer who was trolled on social media for this picture. This is a picture of Taylor Harris doing her job, kicking a goal for the AFL. You'll see that this is a picture of tremendous athleticism, and it was posted by the AFL as an example of just how talented AFLW women athletes are. The competition being a relatively new competition that's proved to be incredibly successful, but is something that needed to be promoted as part of a general trend to really encourage people to take more of an interest in women's sports as an area of athletic excellence. And Taylor Harris was trolled for this picture. A lot of people objectified her body, made some pretty disgusting comments about this particular picture. And what this became was the circulation of this particular image became a real site of conflict, and a symbol that allowed people to talk about the very real presence of sexism in society, which talked about the different opportunities that women don't have in our society. And this is really an excellent representation of the way that the sorts of questions that we can ask about how women audiences engage with media content, again, connect us to understanding how the reception of media, in the practice of being a part of a media audience, quite often engages us in thinking in some quite difficult questions about power in society.